Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this special session that we're having today as part of the Raising Believers Masterclass. We have with us a special guest, Brother Yusuf. Brother Yusuf is from the Sapience Institute. He's a researcher and he is Sapience Institute's Lighthouse Mentoring Manager. I already talked to you about the Lighthouse mentoring scheme, where people can actually phone in, they can book a mentor to help them with doubts that they might be having or questions that they have about Islam. He has a first-class degree in philosophy, mashallah. His focus has mainly been on nihilism and the meaning of life, for which he wrote a dissertation, and he's made many videos discussing the subject. You can find him on YouTube. I think his YouTube channel is Pondering Soul, which focuses on philosophy and theology. He's also a co-host on the up-and-coming YouTube channel Thought Adventure Podcast, as well as regularly featuring on other Dawah channels. MashaAllah, Brother Yusuf embraced Islam in 2014 and has since studied Islam with qualified shuyukh. He hopes to continue these studies alongside his studies in philosophy. So welcome, Brother Yusuf. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for having me.
Many of the parents who have attended our course, some of the parents, they've been expressing concerns about in particular, older children,
Yeah.
they have older children who unfortunately have either stated that they want to leave Islam or that they don't believe anymore, right?
Yeah.
Some kind of statement that has kind of shaken the family, right? And we were hoping that today you could help maybe shed some light on some of the things that it might be good for parents to be aware of in this
Definitely.
regard.
So basically, I run the Lighthouse Project in particular. And I do the managing, so I do all the admin work, but I also take about 50% of the calls. And it has two parts to it, and we're hoping to branch into a third. But the two main parts we deal with are helping people that have doubts. And that may be most of them are born Muslims who book a meeting. They don't really have anyone they feel like they can talk to. If they try to speak to their parents don't really understand. And there's this anxiety around talking about it with the family or with the community. And either they just sort of like hold it in and they live this sort of dual life where, growing up, I was a non-Muslim. I had friends like this. We grew up in a council estate in North Manchester. And there was a Pakistani family that lived down the road, and it was a big family, and they all lived in one house. But the kids would come out, and there wasn't any other Muslims in the area. It was a predominantly like white neighborhood. But these kids would end up hanging about with us. We just sort of grew up together. They went to the same school as us. And while they were with us, they lived a completely different lifestyle. And then when they went back home, they had to switch. And if we ever really saw them with their parents, they were almost unrecognizable. Although they would try to keep us completely separate. We weren't allowed to go knock on for him or anything like that. They were like, there was this big wall that they would try to build between them. And it's quite common. And like a lot of the people that I grew up with that I knew were Muslim would maybe have girlfriends, or it became quite a common issue. But obviously, they're not really going to be communicating this to the family at home. And a part of that is obviously attached to the stigma. But when they're sort of going out, like the non-Muslim world, especially for the youth in particular, is extremely different. Not only just for the Muslims, but even between the parent and child relationship in general. In the UK, there's a huge divide. Especially now we have these sort of dual income families. Both mum and dad are out at work, doing a full-time 9 to 5, sometimes longer. When they come home, everyone's knackered, and there's arguments about whose turn it is to do the housework, because there's a full-time job at home that needs doing, but now because no one's there full-time, there's got to be some sort of debate and discussion about who does that. You've got a bunch of kids in the home. People are not really having, dinners at the dinner table anymore. Everyone's just sort of resigned to their own bedrooms. People eat in their bedrooms.
Mm.
Um, and everyone's just sort of stuck in their own little online world on their own online devices. And if you can think like in terms of how that transforms a family, historically, this wasn't the case. People, when they had dinner, it was usually together at a dinner table. And I'm talking obviously over the past few hundred years, before TV came about, before the internet, before all these devices. This was typically how families would eat. They would eat together. The parents, there was usually one person at home, one person working, bringing the income in. And people were involved to some degree with the raising of their children. But this has been offloaded now to strangers that we don't even really know too much about them. And the schooling system is sort of treated like factory lines where kids are just sort of pushed into it. And they're treated as if the only thing that they have in common is their date of manufacture, their date of birth, and they're just pushed along this conveyor belt. And each year they go to a new class, a new teacher, and that teacher's job is to get X, Y, Z into the kid's head. If for whatever reason the kid doesn't absorb that, the kid is seen as a problem rather than the system being a problem, and they're just sort of pushed along.
Pushed along, yeah.
Yeah, so we're living in a very strange environment. The schooling system doesn't really deal with children on an individual level. It's just sort of abstracted to this sort of ideal. And that like there's this strange development of children in general. Even there's a really good book I can recommend called Teenage by John Savage. I've got it here. It talks about some interesting things, but in particular, it's about the creation of youth from 1875 to 1945. And in particular, it sort of hones in on how during this time, everything just completely changed. Prior to them, we didn't really have this concept of the teenager. Prior to them, there wasn't necessarily public education that was compulsory, that people had no choice and they had to go to. Prior to then, there wasn't something like the automobile. And you had this industrial evolution. The complexity of the working environment kicked off massively. And that required that, well, now we need a better educated populace to get involved in this more complex working environment. And how do we do that? So one of the things they introduced was the public education system that was compulsory. And so people had to start going to this school. And the way that the school transformed as well, they went from like small schoolhouses that were very localized, where the teacher pretty much lived on the estate, and all the kids that went to the school lived on the same estate, and they all knew who was in there. But then with the invention of things like the school bus, all of this kind of stuff, you start having these things called the high school developing, which are these huge institutions which contain thousands of children. And the classes grew in size, and the way, like we said, it's sort of industrialized and treated like a factory. Even like when you think about the aesthetics of a school, even the aesthetics are very factory line based. You've got the ringing of a bell for break and all of this. And it came out of sort of Europe. I think was it Prague? Can't remember where exactly, but it was sort of popularized there, and it was pushed everywhere. But then with these sort of high schools, you have what John Savage refers to as like the invention of the teenager, where you have this subculture that's being developed because these people are essentially adults. And this is why they're separated from younger education. So you've got like, the primary school. And then when they start to reach the age of puberty, there's a line drawn there, and there's a completely different school unit that they then transition to. Because there's a common understanding that it's round about this age that children develop and they change.
Right.
But because the schooling education system has become so complex, and because they need to sort of push them on for longer, because you can't teach them things like, GCSE science, you can't teach that to toddlers. Very rarely, most kids can't absorb that kind of material. So there has to be this sort of separation, and it becomes something that's compulsory, But at the same time, these are young adults. They start developing attractions for the opposite gender, etc. And they're essentially becoming adults. But because they are maintained in a state of dependence, there's this weird sort of tension within them. And myself, I was a bit of a trouble student. I was a bit of the class clown, and I was very good at being naughty but never getting into trouble. And a big part of that was that I resented being treated like a child by these people, because in my head I felt like I wasn't a kid anymore, but they would keep treating you like one. And many schools are like this now, and I think if you've ever been to a high school, or if you're dealing with high school children, you can start to see that there's I don't know if any of you have had this sense, but there's something strange happening with the way that the education system is sort of built. They're not really being prepared for adult life. They're sort of being trained to maintain dependence almost. So they're being trained to be continuous children, even when they should be being shown how to be adults, how to be men, how to be women. But
it's like a prolonged adolescence.
Yes. And it was never like that. It was never like that. Even in the UK, historically, the second you were a boy, if you were a boy, when you hit puberty, you were expected to join the workforce. You were expected to go out and start
people
working.
were in the workforce even before that.
Yeah.
As soon as they were kind of able to think and do anything of use, right?
Yeah. The age of reason in Christianity was the age of 7. That's the age I got my Holy Communion. It's specifically part of Christian doctrine that's the age that you become accountable, according, in the eyes of God. And that sort of like seeped into the culture a little bit. So yeah, there's probably people as young as the age of 7 that were working. But if for whatever reason the family could maintain dependence of the children a little bit longer, sometimes they would. But the second you reached of age, you were put into the workforce. You would even be taken into the pub, expect to drink your first pint. You were treated like an adult. Yes, there was distinctions between this kind of adult and an older adult, like the age of 18. Yeah. Just in the same way as there's distinctions between 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds. But each are still considered adults, just at different stages. And the teenager was accounted as an adult at that point. They weren't treated like children. They were expected to earn a wage. They were expected to contribute and not be completely dependent anymore. But obviously, with the introduction of the education system, this sort of changed. But it only changed aesthetically. Like in terms of the people that are being put through this education system, they're still going through the same things. They're still going through, the hormones and the development of being a young adult. And you're sort of thrown into these crazy environments, especially public schooling. You've got this mixed environment. And a lot of the attention is this competition between the boys trying to get the attention of the girls trying to get the attention of the boys. Obviously, some of you maybe can get your children into segregated schooling, but it's very, very common now that public schools are just not segregated. And all of this develops its own sort of subculture. And you can see how this completely transforms things. Because if you notice, for some reason, the 20th century, you seem to be able to categorize it by the decade. That there's these huge cultural shifts that happen every single decade. And a part of that is the popularization of teenage culture. You have this group of people that you put together, and there's not many adults involved in that. And they build their own culture. They build their own, and obviously you're putting them really close together in these huge groups where they can communicate their likes and their dislikes and whatever's trendy. And there's this new subculture, this new community that you've created by slamming all of these children together. And this continues up to today. And it's been made even more complex by the introduction of the internet, where now you have this sort of global subculture where kids, what's that new thing they were doing not long ago, where everyone's putting sweets into gherkins or something mad. But that was all over the planet. And and obviously that's you can see how these things sort of develop and change these people. But if you're an adult and you're working and you've got your own things that you're trying to work on, you can't really be plugged into what these kids are watching, what these kids are learning about, what trends they're following, what conversations they're having with their friends at school. The majority of classes, they may not be paying attention. They may just be talking to each other. And all of this leads to building this wall that I mentioned with regards to my friend. And maybe many people that you know as well, and maybe even yourselves growing up, if some of you are about my age, maybe you were a part of that generation that had this sort of split life, this, these dual worlds, where you're like one way in front of the kuffar and you're like this other way in front of the family. So this causes problems because when you find yourself in two completely different worlds, communication becomes difficult because they may say things, but you don't live in their world. So you don't know the struggles that they face. You don't know the problems that they have to deal with. And they're different. They are different. We don't live in the same world now that we did last decade. And this is new. And we don't really yet quite know how to deal with this. Because historically, whatever world you grew up in is pretty much the same world your great-granddad lived in. So he could give you advice. He could say, this is what you should expect. This is what you can do. But we can barely even do that for ourselves now, because I have no idea what the world's going to be like in 10 years. There's this rapid rate of change gives rise to a sense of instability where you can't even really prepare yourself for the future, let alone your children. And this causes a huge problem with communication because no one really knows what's going on. And we're just sort of like sticks in the river being carried by the current. And like the language changes, like people are using new words to mean different things. I heard something new the other day and I have no idea what they were communicating at all. They were just saying things. It seems to mean something to the others that were listening, but I really don't know what they were saying. And, and that's just with like slang and culture and all of the things I like, etc. And because of that, there's a sort of an anxiety as well, because obviously you can maybe get in trouble with your parents, etc. And so they build these walls and they sort of stay separate. And the problem with this is that there could be all sorts of things happening here. And you would just have no idea until it's too late, until they grow up and they tell you they're marrying a non-Muslim man, or, they're doing this and they've left the religion, or they want this kind of job, or they're like when it's too late, obviously it can come quite as a shock because you're not seeing the build-up. You're not seeing how this progresses over a long period of time. Did you want to add something? Sorry.
No, not at all. I mean, one of the themes that we have talked about quite a lot is, of course, prevention, right? Like building a good relationship with your kids right from the beginning, being involved in whichever type of schooling you do choose, being involved, helping your children to curate friendships, the right sorts of friendships, and actually creating the environments if they don't have that at school.
Yeah.
To actually be with like-minded people and having other mentors other than yourself. So we've been putting a lot of emphasis on, like you can't as a parent ever outsource parenting. You can't outsource your role as a guide.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, there are still parents who will face problems, right? They will, like you said, they don't really know what's going on.
Because there's, as much as you may like try to implement your effect upon the children, there's still going to be things outside of your control. And we've got Quranic examples of this with the Prophet Noah alayhi salam, his son. Like Noah is one of the best examples of a human being that we have. And even his son was rebellious. Even his son, like he's telling his son to join him on the boat, and his son was saying no. And so this is where obviously we care for our children. And I've just been going through like old pictures of like my daughter and watching her as she's sort of growing and going from this baby, and like the first pictures we had of her and the first videos where she's sort of crying. to like her developing herself as a little human being and like developing her personality, and she's getting a little lisp, and then the lisp disappears, and now she talks like a proper little human, and she walks around like little bossy knickers, telling everyone what to do. And like you obviously, like when like you see them growing up from a complete, oh well, not complete, but like an almost empty vessel,
Yeah.
to like just watching them build up day by day by day, especially when they're younger. Obviously, they're very, very dependent, so you have to be around them constantly. And then as they grow, they slowly they start to become a little bit more independent, and you can see them drift away a little bit. You can see them, and there's a sadness to that. But you love them, and you want what's best for them, and you want to sort of be there. But there is a realization that there are things in your control and things outside of your control. Once they start to develop as a person, then and they develop their own will, all there's, you know, you can do your best, but even then, like I've heard some horror stories about, you know, these Muslims that come from families of sheikhs, and you know they've hafiz of Quran, and you know they've been studying for years, and they're very learned brothers, and then they get caught up in the wrong crowd, and before you know it, they're murtad, and they're doing the craziest things, and they've developed drug addictions, and there's like I've heard crazy stories, but I've also heard crazy, like me as an example. You know, I grew up in a Catholic family that wasn't practicing. My dad was a heroin addict who was in and out of prison. You know, I was a naughty kid. My dad died when I was about 9. My mum was always at work because she was a single mother. We were looked after by my paranoid schizophrenic Polish grandmother who could barely speak English. Me and my brother did what we wanted. We used to go out on the rob as kids. We were just talking about this the other day. When I was 10 years old, my brother was about 8. We broke into a factory that was filled with alcohol, and we took it. We just robbed it, and then we wagged to school the next day and got drunk. At the age of 10, like, so maybe you would look at me and think, you know, bloody hell, like, what a crappy environment for a child. Like, what chances that person got? And I'm by no means perfect, but alhamdulillah, I became a Muslim. I've been a Muslim for nearly 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And like Islam is my life now. Like you know, I love it so
Yep.
much. I call people to it. So like it can go, you know, Allah is the best of planners, and you can plan and plan and plan and do what you want and do what you want, but ultimately guidance is with Allah. And the
Yep.
prophets struggled guiding certain people, even those they loved. Noah alayhi salam with his son, the prophet Lut alayhi salam with his wife, the prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam with his uncle Abu Talib.
Yeah.
And
And
so, go on.
sorry, I was going to say, we do like the one message that I do want to give parents though is that if you're going through something like that at the moment where you feel like your child has made some kind of massive pronouncement, you know, or is going astray or is astray, don't lose hope, you know, because I really want to give that message as well,
Yeah,
because remember, life is a long journey, right?
yeah,
We can't write off our kids. And inshallah, the things that you've put into their minds, in their lives from childhood, there might be phases when those things, it seems like they haven't come through.
yeah,
But with your dua and with, inshallah, taking into account some of the things that maybe we'll discuss today, um, you can, inshallah, bring them back. Or
yeah,
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can, you know, obviously He has the power to bring them back. So don't ever lose hope. Our
yeah,
job
yeah,
as
definitely.
parents is to keep doing our part, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly the point. Is like
Yeah.
I'm trying to take you on a bit of a roller coaster here, where like
Yeah.
there's the tension of there is this element of a lack of control, that
Yes.
things could go the way you want, things could go the way you don't want them to. And there is an element, like, this is where we have to understand who we are. We are Muslims. That is, we are those who submit to the will of God. And that isn't to say that we don't feel hurt or that we're not saddened by the bad things
Yeah.
that go on in our life. We understand it in the context that this life is a test, and that guidance is with Allah, and that we are to be patient and we are to do our best. with the means that we have and the abilities that we've been given. And we can't do more than that. And so there has to be this submission to the things outside of your control, and obviously a bit of reflection with regards to what is in control, what is in your control and what isn't. Now, if you've done your best, if you've done everything that you can to the best of your ability, and even then you may not have done everything, but at least you've tried, you've done something, then that's better than actively working against them, actively pushing them away, actively being abusive, so on and so forth. Like, there's obviously degrees of this, and our job is just to do the best that we possibly can, to be patient, to seek forgiveness where we make mistakes, to try to rectify things, these kind of things. But you're not to lose hope, because even when you get these horror stories where these people do go on blips and they leave, or they apostate. I've got a story just from this past week. What day is it today? When did I speak to them? I can't even remember. I think it was maybe Sunday.
Okay.
And I spoke to a murtad, who had left, and he was dabbling in Christianity, and then he was dabbling in Iraq, some traditional African religion, and he was just all over the place. And so the family invited me over to the house, and we spoke for like 3 hours. And what became clear is what we're going to be talking about today is that him, like many of the young people I speak to, he was just lost. He had no idea what he was doing. He was overwhelmed by too much information, by a secular education that just pummeled him with all of these different ideologies and flattened the value hierarchy to make them seem as if they're all equivalent, they're all true, as if it's just like a cultural thing, like the kind of clothes your parents wear back home. Like religion is equivalent to that. It's something that you can wear, something you can take off. Maybe you could try this other person's clothing on, try this other person's religion, but that a secular education, it just diminishes the importance of the questions religion is attempting to deal with. Even like my own religious education, I remember like we had an hour, and like our days was broken into like 5 1-hour classes, and science was given hours and hours and hours. Like science, you would be broken up into maths, biology, physics, chemistry, geography, and whatever else you had to do. We had ICT, home economics. We had all of these different classes, and history. And they all had a lot of time dedicated to them. And then we had PCSE, which wasn't even just religion. It was like religion and lots of other weird stuff. Yeah. And we were given the worst possible teacher for that class, who had no control. She was the librarian, and it was as if she hated teaching. But we literally, like, I remember we broke her door in half once because we were messing about. She just had no control. We just did what we wanted, and she couldn't do anything. So essentially we didn't learn anything, because it was just, we found it boring by someone who was teaching it, who didn't believe in any of them. And so there was no passion. There was no faith. There was like, it was being taught like we were being taught something, that someone didn't really care about, I didn't believe. And so we just, that's how we saw religion. We were indoctrinated into secularism. We looked at religion as a joke. And our only real experience with religious people, myself, obviously being raised as a Catholic, was like these boring Catholic sermons where you just got this dusty old man at the front just talking in Latin every now and then and changing it up and saying something in English really like slow and drony, and it was all very sad, and like it was just very crap. And then when it came to our experience of like really religious people outside of churches, a lot of the time it was just like crazy people standing on top of boxes and shouting, "You're all going to hell," or Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on your door. There was a strangeness to religious people, and the secular felt normal, and that is indoctrinated to us in our schooling system. And the popular,
even if you're brought up with Islam, I would say the way religion is presented at school is like, there's these 6 religions. They mainly usually present it as 6 religions. They've all got these, strange peculiarities about them, and each of them have a symbol. each of them have this, each of them have that. So basically what happens is you just sort of think, okay, it's just like, it's like a
Like
menu,
Pokemon,
right?
like a
A menu
Pokemon.
of,
Like pick your Pokemon. It's like we're playing Pokemon Red,
mm.
and you got to pick Charmander, Squirtle, or whatever the other one was, Bulbasaur.
And it takes guts to sort of be a Muslim in that environment, even
Yeah,
if you grew up with Islam, and speak up and be willing to say, actually, I don't agree with this, or actually that is true and that isn't true, or right. So,
yeah, yeah. Well,
and it's
definitely,
hard
and
for young people to do that
because
continuously.
because the thing is as well is like, and I've sort of, I'm recognizing this issue as well. Obviously, having my own daughter, um, like in schooling system, and there's certain things that happen that, like, even when you're engaging with the disbelievers, and that you can see they're maybe left leaning and they're trying to be inclusive, and they have this language, and even when you're dealing with Christians or people who believe in God, and they try to neutralize their own religion to incorporate, like, there's some schools in this area. I live in Bolton. Bolton's heavily populated with Muslims, and so even the Christian schools are like majority Muslim. So there's my ex-wife has my daughter most of the time, and I didn't have much control over which school she was going to, and so she's in a Protestant school at the moment, and that Protestant school is 60% Muslim. But they still try to take them to church, and obviously I'm not comfortable with that. So whenever they're going, I take my daughter out, and I bring her here, and I'll teach her some about Islam until they finish, and then I'll take her back, and they go back. But I had to speak to the head teacher about this, and she was basically trying to convince me to let my daughter go to the church, and I'm having none of it because I'm a former Christian, like, and I've been in these churches. I know what's in there, and as much as they try to be neutral, they've got all the stories on the windows. Like they've got, it's there. Like the kids, even if it's not said, it's like it's subtly in their face. And even when they're trying to be neutral, they don't realize they're not being. So they have these conceptions that are un-Islamic. Like they'll refer to God as being the all-loving. Like they say he loves everyone, he loves this, he loves that. And Islamically speaking, we don't say he's the all-loving. There are things Allah hates. There are things that Allah does not like.
Mm.
And obviously, when, like, if they're not clued up with Islamic aqidah, and why would they be? They're not Muslims. These things can sneak in, and so it's very, very, very difficult to manage. Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'll do.
Oh, I remember you were talking about basically the young man who you had been talking to.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So I was trying to give you a bit of hope. It's
Yeah.
so
Yes.
yeah. So he was someone who was confused. He's like the rest of us, as we've been drilled into our head because we've got the internet and we're all overloaded with so much information about all of these different religions, all of these different ideas, all of this information. And there's a problem that our generation face now that no generation before that had to face, is we have everything at our feet. The world's information in the palm of our hand. We've got access to Google, and whatever we want to know, we can start to Google it. We can read books. We've got access to it. And this was sort of put forward like it was a good idea. And naively, like kids with chocolate, because it tasted good at the first bite, we thought it was good. But we've not really thought about the long-term consequences. And in the same way, if you eat too much chocolate all the time, you're going to get diabetes. You're going to become overweight. There's going to be certain health issues that can then lead even to mental health issues, and even potentially kill you. Because when you're sort of like, when you're ignorant, when you're before the singularity hits, before you're exposed to something that is revolutionary, like this is like unlike anything we've ever had to deal with ever. You can't really anticipate what is going to happen after. That's the whole point of what a singularity is. You don't know what's going to happen. And we are a guinea pig era. And all of this technology has been developed. And we've just gone, all right, let's have it. And we've just pushed it all over the globe. And now we've got it and it's here. And we're watching as it's changing society. We're watching,
Right.
like, and no one really knows what's happening. Even like, you can get into conspiracy mindset and we can talk about how there's these people at the top trying to control things, but even they are human beings. They're limited in how much information they can take in. Whatever worldviews they have can affect how they even process that information. And they are not the one in control. ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of planners, and they plan. But it doesn't always go the way they want it either. Even the most richest, the most powerful of people on the earth, they are not Allah. They are not the all-powerful. There are still things outside of their control. And there is chaos in the earth. And what happens is people are exposed to all of this information, and then there's this sort of recognition that, oh crap, like I don't have enough time to really figure things out. Like if you walk into a library and you just think for a minute, how long would it take me to not just read all of these books once, but to read them enough so that I can comprehend what's going on and then not forget the first books I've read by the time I've gotten to the end? How do I absorb all this information? How do I process it? And and especially when that's essentially what a phone is, isn't it? You're looking at the internet and you're like, crap, there's just too much information. And I have not got enough time in life to figure out what's going on. And then this sort of nihilism sets in for many people where they just give up on truth. They give up on being able to find what the answers are. And once they sort of let go of attaining any higher truths, then they just sort of focus on the immediate. And this is why you've got this popularization of things like YOLO mentality, etc. You only live once, just focus on the now. And the kids, they like if they transcend, quote unquote, too much to try to incorporate and connect all the dots of what's going on, it just frazzles their mind. They can't do it. It's a task too big for mankind. And so there's a fear of this because you just recognize how chaotic things are. And especially when you can see everything that's going on in the world. You see the wars in Gaza, you see what's going on with the Uyghurs, you see what's going on with our brothers in Kashmir, and like there's just madness everywhere. And we seem completely powerless to do anything about it. And so what they do is they sort of collapse in on the moment, and then they just focus on what is happening here. And like kids being offered chocolate, they just take it. And they get lost in that. They get confused. And they don't know that there are ways of dealing with this. Like if you find someone who's murdered, you don't need to check every person on the planet. Where were you on the night of, October the 7th or whatever date, what did you do? Blah, blah. No, you can go through a process of deduction and you can rule whole nations of people out because the murder didn't take place in China. It happened in Manchester. And in the same way with religion, you don't need to look into every single religion, but people have this naive assumption that that's something you need to do. You don't. You can group things into categories. If polytheism is absurd, you don't need to look into any polytheistic religion. If monotheism makes sense, pure tawheed, you don't need to take if Trinitarianism is something completely contradictory and it caves in on itself, you don't need to take any of the Christian denominations seriously. You can write them off as a category, and then you can just focus on the ones that fit what does make sense, these sort of fundamental ideas that. And I think this is one of the reasons why Islam is so popular, is because it is the only religion. And with myself, that's what I found, because I went to Buddhist temples. I was looking into Hinduism. Obviously, I was a Catholic. So I was looking into all these things. And the only one that was ticking all the boxes was Islam. But I had some tools. I had an ability to sort of look at the information, categorize things, write them off, and to observe. Now, not everyone has that. Not necessarily because it's something you're born with, but it's just, some Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts people on certain paths, and these things are easier for some and they're harder for others. But people get confused. And so I'm sat with this boy and I'm talking to him, and it's the same story that I've had a million times. He's just a young boy, overwhelmed by too much information, got confused, started dabbling with different stuff, and then just apostatized. And then when I'm speaking to him, I'm asking him questions. He has no idea why he left. He can't tell me why Islam is wrong. He can't even tell me why he's interested in Christianity. He can't tell me why he's interested in this other thing. And so I go through a few basic arguments with him. I show him why Trinitarian theology is contradictory. And it makes sense. And I'm like, all right, so now we don't need to worry about any Christian denomination. If the Trinitarian philosophy is fundamentally contradictory, you don't need to take it seriously. If polytheism as a category just does not make sense, and even within all the polytheistic religions, they have this notion of like the higher God. Yeah, the Quraysh had the same thing. They believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they just had these intermediaries. You see the same in places like Hinduism, in all of these different religions. And if that is absurd, and now I can tell you, why not just skip all of them? Why not just worship the thing at the top? Why not just worship the most worthy of worship? Why bother with all these things that are themselves dependent upon the highest? Once you do that and break it down, and you're like, it didn't take too long. Like 3 hours is a big conversation, but it was making sense to him. And then by the end of it, he took his shahada, and alhamdulillah, I think it was Thursday I spoke to him, and then the next day he's messaged me. He said he went to Jummah, and he's doing much better. But he's depressed. He's lacking like a vision. He doesn't know where he's going. He's a young man, and he's not really been prepared for the world of adulthood, and he doesn't know what's going on. He's confused. And that's just absolutely devastated his man, because he's just not been prepared for a world, mainly because the people that were raising him had no idea what this world was. They couldn't anticipate what life was going to be like now. No one could. Even ourselves as fully grown adults, we're still trying to figure things out. Like what is going on? But the point is that people can go away, they can come back. Like there's all sorts of stuff that can happen. And that's not to say don't feel sad, because obviously it's heartbreaking when these terrible things happen. But it's about remembering to have patience. Yeah, this is a fundamental part of Islam, is to have patience, to like bear these things with patience, to just let things play out and understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one in control. And you need to make a distinction between what is in your control and what isn't. And what you do is the things that are not in your control, you just leave them, because by definition, there's nothing you can do about it. And the things that are in your control, you do what you can, and then you leave the rest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, a couple of things that you can use are the resources that we have with Sapience Institute. So if you go to our website, sapienseinstitute.org, or if you go to our YouTube channel, we just search Sapience Institute, there's lots of material on there and on here as well. And a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to is here. Can you see my screen? You're muted. I don't know if you're saying yes or no.
Yep, you can see.
So here we've got essays, articles, books, answers to certain questions, book reviews, etc. Have a little look through them. There's lots of interesting things on there. All of it's free. Here we've got books. Many of the things I've been talking about with regards to sort of like the overload of information. I've written a book about it. So Islam and Nihilism, My Pose and My Cure. And it covers a lot of these things, and you might find it interesting. But the major thing I want to sort of draw your attention to, you can have a look through all of these in your own time, but it's the No Doubt material. So we've got it as a book, and you can download the book for free. I think you can get a printed copy from Amazon. It's not much. It's just whatever the minimum price is that Amazon charges us for printing. We don't make any profit on it. So it should be pretty cheap. And then we also have the learning platform. So if you go to here, and you can go to our learning platform, and there are loads of courses on here, from secularism, Islam and LGBT, the Londonia, things about the Trinity, things about atheism, Islamic history, nihilism, the art of disputation and debate, a Dawah training course. And again, the one obviously I'm trying to bring your attention to is the No Doubt course. And again, all of these are free. You notice we don't charge for any of them, but they are professionally filmed, academically sourced. They're really good courses. And this goes through in a lot of detail 10 different strategies that you can use for yourself or for anyone that you know that is suffering from doubts. And it's very in-depth, and it goes into a lot of detail. Now, I'm going to give you like a brief cursory overview of that today, very quickly, just because I'm obviously conscious of time. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I will recommend that you try to take that course yourself. And it might even be a good idea to do it as a family, where you just set yourself a certain time once a week, where you go and you watch videos for half an hour, and then as a family you discuss what you've learned, and you just sort of test each other. Okay, so what did we learn in that video? And you just make it a regular thing, and you just power through the course. Or you can read the book by yourself. We also have the Lighthouse mentoring program, which is also free. And you can basically book a one-to-one meeting with either myself or one of the other mentors, and we can sit down and we can have a chat with you. Now, the only thing is, and obviously I'm aware this is for parents trying to deal with their children, is that there is an age limit. We can't deal with anyone under the age of 18 for legal reasons at the moment. It is something we hope to sort of implement in the future, but it's not on the cards anytime soon, because we've just got loads of other milestones we have to hit before we can even get anywhere near that. But we can talk to parents. We can talk to anyone who's over the age of 18 that may be close to these people or dealing with these people. And we can, if they've got certain objections, they're asking you don't know how to handle them, you're more than welcome to book a meeting with us and we can talk to you about how we would deal with them. And generally what we're doing is we're making reference a lot of the time to these 10 strategies. And part of these strategies, 2 of them are about sort of the prevention is better than a cure thing. So like, how before the shubuhat arrives, what do you do? You know, how do you sort of be careful? And that's probably a lot of the things you've been discussing in this course. And then the rest of them are like, what do you do then after it arrives? What goes on after that? And they differ, but we can see here there's lots of different things. And there's 2 categories. So there's the one which is dealing with doubts. So that might be someone who's born a Muslim. That might be someone who's an ex-Muslim. Might be someone who's interested in Islam. Or it might be someone who is dealing with those people, be that a parent with children, be that a brother, or, you know, even nowadays, children with parents that are doubting, you know, or someone who's an imam, or someone who is in a position, you know, in a leadership position, and the community look to them for answers for whatever reason. If you're struggling with certain questions, or you want to sort of, you know, go about discussing certain problems of how to resolve them, you're more than welcome to book a meeting and we can go through these things with you. The No Doubt course is broken up into a few different steps. And the first thing is to talk about there's some big words, but don't worry about them because all the definitions get given to you. But it's about the metaphysical backdrop, which is basically to talk about worldviews. Everyone has a worldview. The Quran mentions everyone has a qibla to which they turn. And it's true. And it's often the case that the atheist or the agnostic tries to make it as if that they don't have a direction, and that having a direction is sort of barbaric and backwards, and that you need to give that up, this having a direction with regards to religion, and become directionless. But it's absurd. You can't be without a direction. Everyone has a qibla to which they turn. And if you're not facing Mecca, you're facing a different direction. You're either facing north, south, west, east, or any of the other directions in between. You cannot help but have a world view. And the education system that you get implements a lot of this into you very subtly, and you don't even realize it. But this sort of goes into this in a bit more detail. The nature of the heart, how the heart wavers, and how people often treat human beings as if they're like robots, and you just got to sort of press a bunch of buttons, input information, and then bish, bash, bosh, you're going to get a shahada out of it in the end. But it's not that. Some people can be rationally convinced of something. So I was looking into Islam for over 7 years. And I recall many years before I took Shahada being convinced. And but yet I did not take Shahada. I couldn't make that leap. Even the brother that I was talking to, who was a murtad on Thursday, who left Islam, by the end of the conversation, I asked him simple questions. I said, okay, so after we've had this huge conversation, I just want to summarize because I've got to go. Do you believe in Allah? He says, yes. I said, okay. Do you believe Allah is one? He said, yes. Do you believe the Quran is the word of Allah? He said, yes. I said, and do you believe Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the final messenger? And he said, yes. I said, oh, subhanAllah. So there's nothing else? He says, no, I'm convinced of all of that. I said, okay, so Bismillah, take your shahada. He says, oh, I'm not ready. I was like, and then it was like, okay, so I've given you, would you say then I've given you lots of good reasons to be a Muslim? And he said, yes. And I was like, okay, so what reasons have you got for putting it off? And his answer, wallahi, was no good reason. And then, so I had to talk to him. I was like, so you're telling me you've got all of these good reasons to take Shahada, you've got no good reason not to, and yet you're inclining towards not taking it. Why? And a lot of it was just tied down to anxieties, like a fear, like expectations that are entailed with that. It's not necessarily like a rational problem. It was the fear of having to be this perfect Muslim. And then we had to have a conversation about, you're not expected to become a perfect Muslim overnight. It wasn't even the case for the Sahaba. The Quran was revealed to them over a period of 23 years. It wasn't just dropped on them. And I'm pretty sure even within the Quran and the Hadith, it talks about, had it been given to them all at once, they would have fled from you. So it was given to them in stages, piece by piece, and they were developed. The belief was put into their hearts first, and then the rulings, when they came, it was easy for them to accept it. There's the narrations about when alcohol became forbidden. The narration talks about how they all came out with their alcohol and started pouring it in the street. The fact that they all came out with alcohol suggests they were all practicing it. That was something they all engaged with. There's hadith that talk about some of the Sahaba getting drunk and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam having to deal with them getting into shenanigans while they're having parties. So like they weren't expected to become super Muslim overnight, and they're said to be the best generation, the first generation. And yet now one of the biggest challenges a lot of children face is that like that it's almost as if they're expected to be the best Muslim. And there's this huge anxiety that if you do go out there and you represent Islam, you've got to be like, you know, as good as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the issue is it's just not, it's not realistic. It really is like a huge benchmark to expect a young person to hit immediately. And so a lot of it was just about setting expectations to them. Say, listen, baby steps, step by step, develop yourself slowly, make a clear target for yourself and work towards it. But this is tied into this notion of the nature of the heart and understanding how that takes a part of this whole process of dealing with doubts, that people are not just minds, that their feelings can affect their ability to think. And I've got really good examples. I had a friend who was an absolute genius. He was a really clever guy. He went to university. He got degrees in mathematics. He did really well. He's a big time accountant now. Really clever kid. And then any other day, he was quite, you know, a very, very rational person. And then he was obviously a non-Muslim, but he fell in love with some girl. She broke his heart and he became an idiot overnight. And he was like, oh, if I just send her 10,000 messages, maybe she'll fall in love with me again. If I just like bother her and pester her and seem dead pathetic, maybe she might see how much she needs me. And it's like, you have to sit down with this person. What's going on? I thought you were a clever guy. What makes you think this is going to work? And it was not about his brain. It was his heart was broken, and that had an impact on his rational faculties because both of them are affected. And this is a part of the religion as well, where, you know, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam narrated, you know, if you're angry and you're stood up, go sit down. And if you're sat down, go lie down. Like, you need to take yourself away and you need to calm down, because when you're in this state of emotion, you can be the cleverest guy on the planet. It's not going to matter because your heart gets in the way of that. And this is something that is often neglected, how the heart can affect the direction to which people move. And you're a human being. You need to take this into consideration, not just for yourself, but the people that you're engaging with. Today's crisis and challenges, we've already sort of spoke about these a little bit today, like how today is unique. And so even like thinking about how maybe they used to deal with things 200, 300, 400 years ago. Yes, essentially there's a lot of patterns and there's many things that are still the same and very applicable today. But there is something very unique about today's situation because with the implementation of things that no previous generation has had to deal with, like the internet, for example, TikTok, all of these crazy things. And even to the degree that even if you keep your kids away from these things, if they go to school, they're going to be talking to kids that go on these devices and they're going to be affected by it. And you can try build your walls around them, but eventually they're going to have to step beyond the wall. So you have to prepare them to some degree. You can't think you can just put them in this bubble and then that's it, they're safe. Because there can be a huge shock for them. And this happens a lot, where parents cocoon their kids. They go, no, we're homeschooling them. They're being locked in the house. I'm keeping them out from, they're not going anywhere near any of this fitna. And then they grow up, they become adults. Mum and dad eventually pass away, and then they've got to go out into the world. And they're like, I have no idea what's going on. And then it's forced on them. It's something that they have to deal with. So these are things you've got to take into consideration, the crisis and challenges of today. Sources of doubt. So there's different sources of doubt, and we sort of go into them in a bit of detail, and then dealing with yours and other people's doubt. And so then there's the 10 strategies in particular. So be aware, no attention. Be aware is simply to say, you can get these slides, by the way. There's a lot of information here, and just because obviously we've been talking a lot, and I want to move into a sort of Q&A session. How long have we got, by the way? Did you say till 7:30? You're muted. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, we've got about 25 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay. So I'll just run through these quickly. But like I say, if you want to go into this in a lot more detail, I recommend just taking the course or just reading the book. So I'll just stick on this one slide. You can get the slides on the learning platform. So do check that out in your own time, inshallah. But these are the 10 strategies here. So you've got be aware, which is to say, if you're going into a dangerous environment, you need to be aware you're in a dangerous environment. And if you let your guard down, this can be trouble for you. Like if you go out into the jungle and you know there are tigers in the jungle, the last thing you want to do is be going around like making yourself a target, letting everything know that you're here and acting flippantly. You have to be aware of your situation. And to a degree, that means be self-reflective. Look at the world. Look at what's going on around you. Try to act with wisdom. You don't have to. Not everything needs to be said out loud. Not everything needs to be propagated. You need to be someone who chooses his words carefully, and steps carefully. If you're walking through a minefield, the last thing you want to do is just not watch where your feet are going, because you're going to step on a mine eventually. And this is what we mean. Like, be aware. Like, if there are dangers around, watch where you put your feet. Watch where you put your feet. Be aware of what's going on. And this is like preemptive. So this is part of the prevention. No attention refers to just not giving certain things attention. For example, if you've got certain waswas and stuff that pop up in your head, not everything needs to be delved into. And I have an example of someone who did not take this into consideration. It was a young man, and he would email me every day saying, I have all of these doubts. I have all of these shubuhat. I need your help. I need your help. And I said, okay, let me see. And he sent me a list of thousands and thousands of, like, this huge document where he lined out every single one. Each one had its own video. And it was just one after the other, after the other, after the other. And I was like, how have you, he was only young. He wasn't even that old. I think he was like 17 or some kid on Discord. And he just had a ridiculous amount of them. And then I got talking to him, and he didn't even know what the majority of them were. Most of the videos he hadn't watched. He was just so obsessed with the existence of these shubuhat that he began to collect them like Pokemon cards. And he just compiled them. And the fact that they existed, he obsessed over their existence. And even like the most simple one, I was like, okay, which one's the biggest deal for you? And he brought that one, and I would ask him questions about it, and he couldn't even articulate what the problem was. I was like, these aren't shubuhat. You don't even understand the problem. You can't articulate it to me in any way. And his issue was he was giving them all too much attention. Like, he was so focused on the fact that they exist that it made him panic, and it made him act incredibly silly. And so, like, certain things you have to recognize don't require your attention. Like, for example, if you're walking through the street, there may be someone walking with a dog. You don't need to make a big deal. You don't need to start screaming and panicking. Sometimes don't pay attention to the dog and just walk straight past it can be the best method of overcoming an obstacle or not getting yourself into a situation. Sometimes you can just ignore things and they can go away. And just in the same way, clouds, they come and they go, they pass. The tide, it comes in, it goes out. And patience in this regard can deal with a lot of the issues. Just having the ability to let go. Like with this kid, all he had to do was just let go of certain things. Because most of them, like going through the list, most of them were just the most absurd things. They were like the silliest of doubts or the silliest of objections. One of them be like, Islam worship, the Muslims worship the moon. It's like, bro, like there's a verse in the Quran that just completely obliterates this idea. Like, do not worship the sun or the moon. These things are creations of Allah. Worship the one who created them. It's such a simple thing.
It sounds like he'd maybe just compiled it from some anti-Islam website and just paid too much.
It was a personal list that he made, and when I spoke to him, it became clear that he was basically just going down these YouTube wormholes. And whenever he found a new thing, he put it into his document, and he just amassed them. And it was like a very scruffy list. You could tell it was just like nothing from a website. It was just his own little collection of links and comments, and nonsense, basically. There were some things that he'd gotten from, because there was links to certain websites on there as well, like these anti-Islamic websites. But yeah, he was just this young kid who treated them like Pokemon, and he just tried to collect them all. So yeah, the main point here is that there are certain things you don't have to pay attention to. That's not to say stick your head under the sand, because certain things will need your attention. And this is where the next bit comes in, making the distinction. So there is a difference between different kinds of things. And there's an image, if I can pull that up. Making it, yeah. So if I was to ask you, what's the difference between these things? I couldn't even tell you what they were, to be honest. I have no idea. The slides were produced by Sheikh Fahad, by the way. So I think he knows the names of all these berries. Oh, there we go. So yeah, like if you were starving, there's a famous film called Into the Wild about a man who goes into the wild and he's trying to survive and he's trying to find sources of food, and he's gotten to a point where he's starving to death. And he's got a little book and he's trying to find some berries that he can eat. And his big mistake is, spoiler alert, he picks up the wrong berries. And he can't make the distinction between them. Now, some of these may look delicious, or maybe you don't agree. Maybe they don't look delicious. But, you know, so one of these things you can eat, the other would kill you if you did. And it's important to be able to make the distinction between these things. And it's the same when it comes to doubts. Everyone comes and they say, I have a doubt, I have a doubt, I have a doubt. But when you question them on it, a lot of the time, it's not even a doubt. A lot of the time, it's just waswas. A lot of the time, they can't even articulate it. A lot of the time, it falls under one of the other two categories. But because they can't make the distinction, they treat it like it's a shubuhat. They go into a panic and they don't know what to do. And so then they start getting worried that then maybe now I'm a kuffar and, you know, what do I do? What do I do? And they come running to us and we talk to them. And by the end of it, 90% of people are like, oh, thank God. Like, okay, so it's just a question, or it's just the waswas. It's not really something you need to worry about. So the first one is the waswas, whispering. Whispers are akin to, like, you hear someone saying something on the bus, you don't believe it, you don't, it makes you feel bad that you've even heard it, and you even talk against it. Like someone says something about, you know, someone you love. If someone is bad mouthing your mother on a bus and you hear that and you stand up and you say, no, that's not true, that's not a shubuhat. Number one, you don't believe it. Number two, there is an aversion within your own heart against it. And you don't recognize it as a truth. And you dislike the presence of it in your experience whatsoever. And this is something that the Sahaba had to deal with. We've got a narration here by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, where he said, some of the companions of the Messenger of Allah came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said to him, we find in ourselves thoughts that are too terrible to speak of. He said, are you really suffering from that? They said, yes. And he said, that is a clear sign of faith. And then there's another one narrated by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, who said, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, truly Allah has overlooked for my ummah that which is whispered, or that which is thought about in the lower self, as long as they do not act upon it or speak about it. And this alone deals with so many issues, because people, they're afraid to even mention they have these waswas, and they assume it's a shubuhat, and then they live with it. They live with this guilt. They live with this pain inside of them, and it can manifest into something worse, because the presence of this waswas and not knowing it's a waswas rather than a shubuhat can damage their iman, because as far as they're concerned, they're possibly a kuffar already, because they have these waswas and they've not been able to make the distinction, which is why it's important to teach people the difference between a waswas and a shubuhat. And just that one little thing alone, and even not just that, but questions. Some things are not even waswas. Some things are genuine questions that are valid. And the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would constantly go to the Prophet and ask him questions. They would ask questions. The questions themselves are not necessarily a bad thing. It depends what the issue is. If you're just wanting to learn about the deen and understand what aqeedah is, what the Islamic position is about certain things, there's no problem in asking these questions. It's not an issue. And the ones that you want to worry about are specifically shubuhat, and these are said to be falsehoods that undermine the fundamentals of Islam, or distort the religion in any way. and the person is unsure about the truth of the fundamentals of Islam because of these things. And so they're described as like a wolf in sheep's clothing. And they're like things that mix truth with falsehood. So there's bits of truth in them. And so they, like, for example, a common thing that the Murtad will do is maybe bring a hadith that's sahih. And they say, look, this is what your religion says. So they bring a truth. Yes, the religion, this is part of our religion. It's from Sahih Bukhari. It says X, Y, Z. And so they brought a truth. And then what they do is they start to add falsehood to it. And so they say, if this is from your religion, then that means this. And then that means this. And then that means this. For example, the verse of the Quran that says, and kill all the disbelievers wherever you find them. They bring this and say, look, this is in your Quran, a truth claim. Yeah, and you can check it. You look in the Quran. Oh, yeah, it does say that. It is that is what it says. And then they'll add to it and say, that means if you ever meet a disbeliever, you've got to kill him. Your religion commands you to kill all the disbelievers. Now, what they've done is they've mixed truth with falsehood. If the person has no idea what the Islamic position is, hasn't seen the verses before or after, hasn't understood the context, when was this verse revealed? What did the primary audience understand from that? It's very easy for someone to get confused with that. And then they're expected to have to defend it, and they don't know how to. And so they flee from it. They flee from it. They run away because they don't want to say what that says. They don't want to own up to the inferences, but they've been convinced, they've been hoodwinked, they've been bamboozled into thinking that this truth claim, which can be verified to be true because they brought the evidence and it's there, you can't argue with that. And then they attach a load of inferences to it. And if someone isn't really prepared to deal with that, that can be devastating, especially in the context of a young person in front of a crowd of people that don't believe what they believe. If you're the only Muslim in a group of people and you're surrounded by 10 disbelievers, and this one brings it, shows the verse, and everyone sees it, and they're all like, oh yeah, it does say that, it does say that. You can't get a word in edgeways. Whenever you try to say something, someone's interrupting, and then, but it's there, but it's there, but it's there. That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure. And in that, some youth can't do anything but just flee from that and then throw it out the window and say, oh, then I don't believe it. No, I don't believe that. And then they're dealing with this idea, I have just denied the Quran, I am a kuffar. And they continue to live like that then. So that's an issue. But they've, like we say, they've been hoodwinked. The truth has been mixed with falsehood. And this is essentially what a shubuhat is that there's always these extra little bits attached to a truth claim, and it's made to appear to be something that it's not. Or there are fundamental things like a worldview, we were speaking about a worldview, that people have had instilled in them from a very early age. Like, for example, this idea, it's fine to do something so long as it doesn't harm anyone else. We hear this a lot. And this is something in the public education system that's said very subtly, constantly, over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then when it comes to things like the issues surrounding things like the LGBT, things around zina, all of these things, what they do is they draw a circle around the act and they say, well, no one's being harmed by it. And then they look at it and they go, oh, yeah, you're right. And they fall back on this worldview that they've been given. And then they go, so why is this haram? It's not harming anyone. There's no problem with it. But that's just because this arbitrary line has been drawn around the act. And there's not wider implications being taken into consideration. And so this feeds into all the other things. So your environment, thinking about like where you are, the people you're with, all of these things have a huge impact. And there's different kinds of conformity. There's all sorts of studies that have been shown that like there's, it might be related to this image. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to tell you the one in my head. What's that guy called? Darren Brown. He does this experiment where he's got 3 actors and they're standing up and sitting down on chairs every time a bell goes off. And they've been told to do this. They're paid. They know exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it. Darren Brown told them to. And then they bring in strangers. And these people have no idea what's going on. And they come and they sit down in a chair. They're told to fill out a form. And then every time the bell goes off, everyone stands up. And then they're looking and they don't know what's going on. And then the bell goes off and the people sit down. And then eventually these people just imitate everyone else. And the bell goes off, they stand up. Bell goes off, they sit down. And then they keep bringing people in. And then when the room's full, they take the actors out and replace them with other people. And they keep pressing the bell. And now you've got a room filled with people standing up and sitting down. because the bell's going off, and no one knows why they're doing it, because the only people that did know have been removed. And it talks about social conformity. And if you're a Muslim in a minority environment, there's a lot of this happening, yeah, where especially, and it's inescapable. Even if you like mollycoddle your kids, eventually they're going to have to get a job. Eventually, they're going to experience being a minority in a majority non-Muslim environment, and that has an impact. People can look up to certain people, and that can affect their iman. There's certain, like, they may have some friends that they really like, and this friend does this, that, and the other, and they're living this fun lifestyle. They get to drink alcohol and take drugs, and they've beautified it. I was one of them. When I was younger, I was really into weed culture, and I used to beautify it. And I wouldn't show people all the problems associated with it. I wouldn't show people. I would even lie to myself, try to tell myself I wasn't addicted. And I had all of these films that I loved that were like about weed culture, and like I acted as if it was just, if only everyone smoked weed, it would solve everyone's problems. And the reality of it was not, that was not the case. Alhamdulillah, I left that behind a long time ago. But I was someone who used to introduce people who had never smoked it to it, including Muslims. And may Allah forgive me for it. But it was like, and my character type was a dominant one. So if there was someone that was maybe a bit more submissive, who maybe looked up to me or admired me in any way, it was very easy to sort of carry them along and bring them up onto this, this ideal that I had, just because of the type of person they were. And so you need to be careful of that. The environment that they're in, you need to tell them as well that this is the kind of thing that they need to think about. Because if they recognize the type of relationship they have with someone, because we've got the hadith about the blacksmith and the oud seller that everyone's familiar with. And the question is because this can be quite complex. Sometimes you might be a blacksmith. Sometimes you might be an oud seller. Sometimes the person you're with might be a blacksmith in one context and an oud seller in another. And what happens when the blacksmith hangs around with the oud seller? Maybe the oud seller might make the blacksmith smell a bit nicer, but as well, the other thing could happen as well. And you need to be cognizant of that relationship that you have with the people you're engaging with and act accordingly. If you find yourself to be someone who is easily intimidated, like, so a young person goes into university, they're all the same age, you've got this peer group, all of them are very opinionated, they're all atheists, secular, liberal, feminists. How are you going to act in that kind of environment? Are you a dominant character? Can you withstand having a minority opinion in front of a crowd of people who disagree with you? Can you do that? Not everyone can. When I went to university, I went there much later. I was like 27. I traveled around the world for 18 months before that. I had a wife. I had a daughter. I couldn't give a crap what all of these kids thought. I did not. They wanted to do all these things. I didn't want to go to the pub. I'd been there. I'd done that. I was over it. I did not care if they liked me. So when I was in this environment, it was completely different for me. I could stand there and hold the Islamic position, tell them I believe in God, and they could laugh. It didn't affect me. I didn't care if he laughed at me. Who was he? He's some little kid. God knows, where he's from, what environment. Like, my intention was not to please them. I was there to get a first class. That's all I wanted. I couldn't care whether or not they liked me about it. And so I'd argue with them about feminism. I'd argue with them about liberalism. I'd argue with them about their atheism and all of these assumptions that they were making. And if they mocked religion, I'd say, well, what do you know? Like, what objections have you? And then I would tear apart their objections. Like, I could engage in that because my character type is quite a dominant one. And in those environments, I'm not swayed by a crowd. They could all stand up together and shout at me, and I'd just laugh at it. It's not, that isn't an issue for me. But that's not the case for someone who's maybe 17, 18 years old. They've been mollycoddled all their life. They've never been in an aggressive situation. They've never even had a fight. Like, I've had much worse situations. Like I say, I grew up in a council estate where, like, you've got people waving knives in front of your face. I'm not going to be intimidated by some little kid from Oxford who's
But it shows you, doesn't it, that we should encourage our kids to speak up, because unfortunately sometimes in Muslim cultures, some Muslim cultures, children are encouraged to just be quiet and listen to the adults and, not question anything, not speak their mind. And of course, there's a line between being respectful and disrespectful, but the same time, I think it shows you that we have to sort of foster that ability in a child for it to be okay for you to be different, to speak up, to
Yeah,
challenge.
definitely. But it has to be done in a certain way, because it's not like we didn't have that kind of thing in our environments. Like growing up, I couldn't talk to my dad. I couldn't give him feedback. I'd get a slap about the back of the head. Like we did have that with our elders. It's not so much now,
Yeah.
because obviously the society's softened a lot. But my uncle used to chase me with a samurai sword if I was naughty. Like there was this like aggression. That what sort of developed that lack of care was a nasty side of life. Like I was
Right.
exposed
Life
to,
experience.
yeah, and like I had to go out, and I was engaged with gangs. Like we used to hang about with this huge group of lads, and we go out on the rob, or we go out taking drugs, and like I had active experience with scary places and scary people. And so when it came to like dealing with, and it wasn't like it was, no one put it on me. It was just you, like a rock rolling down the hill, you end up there. Like it is, like my mum obviously wouldn't have ever wanted me in those situations. My dad tried to prepare me for that, and he would take me out for walks in the night. He used to make us watch horror movies. Like his way of developing me was probably not very good, Islamically speaking. But if you look at like how the Sahaba and that used to maybe deal with their children, where the children were exposed to things like fighting, they could see wars happening, or they could see injuries, and there was a different environment. They saw hardship.
Tough
Yeah, so
environment. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so like there is a way of doing that from an Islamic perspective, where you do introduce your children to hardship, to difficulty, in such a way so that it strengthens them. The question is obviously, like in today's context, how do we do that? Because we're very self-conscious about our community and how the outsider looks at us, and we're constantly trying to like reassure everyone, don't worry, we're not a danger. And this, I think, sort of makes us overcompensate with softness, and there's going to be like a long-term sort of consequence of that. But it's an environment. Long story short, there's a lot to think about with environment. Let me try to get through this. Study Islam. Like a lot of things can be overcome if you just understand Islam. I mean, study Aqidah, study fiqh. Like, what is the Islamic position on these things? Because the amount of times where there's been someone who's like told what Islam is by a disbeliever who does not have a single idea about what Islam is, the Muslim then panics because they don't know. And they're being, like we talked about before, someone says, oh, your Quran tells you to kill all the disbelievers. And then they show the verses, and then they're telling them, so you can get your wife in a headlock and punch her in the eyes and pull her teeth out. And that's not what it means. That's not what it means. But they're being told this. And because they've not studied Islam, because they've not really embodied it, one of the biggest problems with the Muslim culture in the UK, with the people of my age, my generation, was that all they were really taught was how to read Arabic with bad tajweed, and then that was it. You've got to memorize the Quran. You don't really know what you're reading. And the amount of people I know that have read the Quran from front to back in Arabic, but never read it in a language they understand. So they can tell you all these surahs, they can recite them, but they don't know what it means. And that's a problem, because part of like reading the Quran is like, it's trying to communicate. Allah's talking to you. Yeah? He's trying to communicate something to you. But if you're going around China and like you're trying to learn, like in universities in China, and you're listening to the lectures, and you can repeat what the lecturer says back to him, what point is that when it comes to the test? If you have no idea what you're supposed to write down now, because you don't understand what's being asked of you, you don't understand what's being communicated, that like you have to understand to at least some degree what you're learning. What is it that's being communicated here? What is Islam? What does it mean to be a Muslim? And it needs to go beyond just like these sort of cultural surface level elements that's often put forward. Study Islam, like come to understand what it is. What is the Islamic position? What is it that the Muslims believe about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about the Quran, about the prophets, about like what you are as a person? Who are you? What are you doing here? How are you going to do it? If you understand these things, like when they come up to you with misconceptions, it's not going to affect you because you're already prepared. You have your shield, you have your sword, you're ready. metaphorically speaking. So yeah, study Islam. There's different like examples of common misconceptions, like the age of Aisha, the age of consent. Women's inheritance is another one. All these misconceptions that surround this, that give rise to different shubuhat. And if you just study it, you come to understand it, and keep things like worldviews into consideration, these things cease to be a problem. What else have we got? Critical thinking. Critical thinking. It's just the amount of times I've had to speak to someone who's just got, it's not even a shubahat, it's not even a waswas. They've just got a question where they go to someone who's supposed, in a position of power in the community. They're supposed to be some type of leader, the imam or the parent, the father. They've asked a genuine question and they're just sort of abused for it. Like, how dare you ask such a, it's questions the Sahaba have asked sometimes. And they're being sort of treated as if they've done something terrible. There's no empathy. There's no, like, just how dare you ask this? And this sort of inculcates this fear of thinking, this fear of engaging. And but the thing is if you're reading the Quran and you're doing what we said in the last one, and you're understanding what it's saying, you could end up doing things that you might, the Quran is telling you to do. That it's sort of making it very clear that the fact that the disbelievers do this is blameworthy upon them. Like, for example, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he goes to his people, says, why are you doing what you're doing? You've got these practices, you've got these beliefs. Why? And their answer is, Mum and Dad did it. Mum and Dad did it. It's what we found the people that came before us doing. And this is made very clearly, is put forward as, this is not a very good reason. What if Mum and Dad left the religion, would you leave as well? Like, why are you a believer? Why do you believe what you believe? Is it just because Mum and Dad believe it? Is it just because by accident you were born into this family? Or do you believe because it's true? And Allah says, there are signs in the heavens and the earth and within your own selves for those who reflect, for those who ponder, for those who look out into the world and look upon the signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has left. Read the Quran. Think about it. Engage with it. Read the commentaries. Read what the pious people have said about these things. Go into it. Study it. Learn it. Think about these things. Even the objections, like when an atheist comes to you, one of the biggest problems at the moment are the things we get taught in school. Sometimes there seems to be a conflict with Islam. Like, the common ones being like evolution, or whatever else is that they're trying to teach. And this is just being given. Like, one thing they said is that like random mutations are a given. Like, this is something you cannot question. And this was taught like it was Bible. If you ever tried to object against this, you'd be ridiculed, especially if you were within the scientific community. It wasn't that long ago. It turns out not everything is random in terms of what they think with regards to random mutation. This was something they had to let go. The theory of phlogiston. They had this whole theory of this substance that was released when you burn things. And they had a whole discourse on it where the elites would talk about this thing. And it turned out it didn't even exist. But they had a whole discourse on it. There's something the intellectuals spoke about, and it just was not a thing. And so, like, if you engage in critical thinking and you understand where things like this is something that can help you, but it can be taken too far where people get to a sense of extreme skepticism and they treat tools as if you can use them for everything. Like someone uses a hammer to make a sandwich or pick up a glass. Like, no, a hammer's got particular uses, and it's the same with critical thinking. Like, there's certain things that it's going to be useful for, and there's certain things where like it's going to be useless. Like, for example, people talk about the Xtra, the contents of the Xtra, and they're like, you need to show me with reason alone why the paradise exists and why there's mansions there and so on and so forth. But that's completely misunderstanding how critical thinking applies, because there's certain, like, you can see my office, but critical thinking isn't going to tell you about what's behind the camera or what's out of view or what's through that door. You can't use critical thinking alone to get those answers. Yeah? There's other things that you need. Sometimes you need evidence. Sometimes you need testimony. Sometimes you need experience. Like, there's other things that go with critical thinking that can take you to certain conclusions. And so this is something as well that can be delved into a lot. And just because I've rambled and we're running out of time, I am going to gloss over it, but I do recommend the course. And if you want to talk more about it, obviously you can book a Lighthouse meeting. Find a specialist. So that could be like going to an imam or a scholar, asking questions about certain things. Is this the Islamic position on this? They can give you that answer. Maybe booking a Lighthouse meeting and coming speaking to one of us who've got, experience dealing with atheists quite a lot, and this kind of objections they come with. But find a specialist. Don't just try to deal with this on your own, and don't just assume that there isn't anyone and just say, oh, don't bother, because these things, they can linger, they can manifest. And if it's not just a waswas, if it's not just a genuine question, but if it is a genuine shubuhat that is affecting the heart of the individual dealing with these problems, not finding a specialist could be a huge problem. Because just finding one and having that conversation, I can't tell you how many times people have booked a Lighthouse meeting, they've had a quick conversation with us, and then, alhamdulillah, at the end of it, they're over the moon. At the beginning, they're nearly in tears because they're worried about being a kuffar. Like, have I left the religion? Am I cursed? Am I this? Am I that? By the end of it, they realized there wasn't a problem at all. That they're not even, it's not a shubuhat. It was a question. There are answers, or it was a waswas. It's something they can ignore. It's not something that undermines the religion. Finding a specialist can itself be like finding a doctor. And you've got this illness. If you just leave it, the gangrene can spread. But if you find someone who knows what it is and can treat it, that can deal with it. Trauma. The amount of times people have just trauma from abuse, from dealing with the community. We mentioned like the sort of atmosphere in British mosques in the 80s, 90s. I can't tell you how many people have trauma going to the masjid because of how they were dealt with during the process of being taught the Quran. Where if they mispronounced something, they were beat with a stick. And this can affect the way you view something. Having a negative experience with an ex-husband, and he was a very abusive person, and so on and so forth. And he was a Muslim, and he was like, the hadith that says, don't women are like, can you remember call the hadith about the women being like a stick, and if you try to straighten it too much, it might snap. What's the hadith? You recall it? Can you hear me?
Can you repeat the hadith again? The
hadith is describing women like a stick that is bent, and if you try to straighten it too much, you could snap.
A rib, yeah, the rib.
Like a rib. That's one.
Yeah.
And you get some men that put too much tension on individuals, and they don't take this, the Islamic ethos into consideration. You're not to put too much pressure on. You're not to damage people and make them snap. Yeah. And they've had to deal with this, and maybe it's a child looking at a father who was abusive or a mother who was abusive to either them, the children, or to the significant other. And then that just paints the entire religion that the abusive person was associated with in a negative light. And especially linking
so
again.
In other words, sometimes it's not a rational thing, that even though the person is saying, oh, it's because I don't believe in this, that, and the other, when you dig a bit deeper, you find out actually they're just using that as a cover for some.
I can't tell you how many times this has happened where someone comes to me with objections, and then I ask them to articulate it, and they're like, hold on, that doesn't make any sense. And when I push them on it, it isn't about that at all. That's just like a cover. That's just something that masks the real issue. And like, they don't really understand why it's a problem. It's just an excuse that makes them feel better about the real reason they left. And when you dig, and it's like, actually, I had this abusive father, or, my husband, or my this, or my that, or I grew up around Muslims and they were very cruel to me. And because of the way that they treated me, I just didn't want anything to do with that community. And you say, why? What happened? And it's just like the crappiest stories you've ever heard. It's like, that's crap. I can't believe they did that to you. And then you speak to them, you're like, that's not Islamic. Like, there's nothing in the Quran and the Sunnah that justified them treating you like that. That's just them being terrible people. And then they're like, oh, and then you go into it and you're like, yeah, look, there's this reference from the Quran, here's this hadith. Like, it's telling you to treat people with kindness, to like not snap them, not be cruel, not abuse each other with foul words. Like, if they're doing these things to you, they are blameworthy. And then when they start to realize that, and it's like, if they practiced Islam, that would never have happened to you. What you have a problem with isn't Islam, it's with their their deviation from it.
Right.
That's what, and that could be a number of things that's affected them. That could be the fact that they're embedded in this non-Muslim society and they've been impacted by these sort of societal norms. But trauma plays a huge part of it, and sometimes facing that trauma is very, very difficult because it's tied in with a heavy amount of emotions, and it requires a lot of patience. And depending on like the severity of the things that the people have gone through, like that can be big. Like that, you could prepare yourself for a screaming match. It might be something you've got to sit down and go through. But sometimes people fear that trauma. They fear that tension that arises from letting that bubble to the surface, and they just try and push it down and avoid it. Well, sometimes you have to go through it. Sometimes you have to let people cry, and you have to be there with them and cry with them and hug them. And it's a very, very important bit that's neglected heavily, and it's because it's scary.
Some parents, they consider sending their children to non-Muslim therapists, okay, when they're going through doubts, okay. And now, although therapists can be good for, a problem that you're facing, that maybe some psychological problem that you want to overcome, I'm quite reticent to encourage or even say that it's a good idea to send children to a therapist who are having doubts, if they've got trauma and they've got doubts. Because I don't know what you think about this, because in my experience with therapists, I've been to therapists myself before, and I know family members who have, because they're coming from a non-Muslim paradigm. If that child was to start expressing their doubts to that therapist, the therapist would almost like help them to double down on those doubts. Do you know what I mean? And really like lean into it and really like, and of course validate them leaving Islam, right? So it's quite hard, I guess, for parents if they know that their child has gone through a trauma that needs to be dealt with. Maybe they feel that they need therapy, but then they've also got doubts. Maybe those two things need to be dealt separately. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a massive problem. And this sort of leans into this, like we have this niche that we need to sort of fulfill. And a part of that is we do need Muslim counselors, like people who
that would be an alternative. Exactly.
Yeah, that's like the ideal, is that we have people that have our worldview, that understand our problems, that can make the distinction between like the psychological issues that need resolving and maybe things that are not necessarily psychological, like illnesses, so to speak, but rather the things we've been discussing with these, no doubts, like the environment, the this, the that, etc. Now, what you've just said is exactly what happens, because the focus of the non-religious secular psychologist is the individual. They're not cared about anything else. Like they just want to try and
care about right or wrong. They don't care about your marriage. They don't, like, you could come to them with, somebody could come to them with thoughts of, breaking up their marriage or having an affair or whatever it is. They would never sort of pass a moral judgment on it at all.
Yeah. And they even, what their job really is just to get you to be honest with yourself. Now, the thing is being honest with yourself, we can be infected by, we're not perfect. We're not these moral exemplars. We are finite beings with a mixture of good and bad desires. And simply getting someone to just be honest with themselves, that can make them feel good in a moment where it's like, what they do is that they're basically focusing on the things we spoke about, and they're highlighting certain things to them. They're like, oh, so you're anxious. And the reality might be is that they're worried about upsetting their parents. They're worried about, letting mum and dad down. They're worried about expressing these doubts to them, because if they do, that might, so on and so forth. And what the non-Muslim psychologist is going to do here is just be like, okay, keep going. And then what that person might end up doing is just expressing, like, I'm sick of being worried about this. Like, I just want to be able to, like, and it's just this sort of wanting to break free. I just want to be able to like think about these things and express my thoughts and do this and do that without worrying about people shouting at me and blah 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 blah. And then they'll just egg it on. Like, yes, keep going, because like it looks like this person's going through this like revelatory moment. Okay, you've been honest with yourself, yeah, but are you really completely cognizant about what the best way moving forward is? Yeah, just simply describing how things have been doesn't tell you anything about what you should do next.
Right.
And there's this huge gap between what is and what ought to be. And the therapist is just trying to get the person to just be completely honest about what is the case.
Right.
But then it's like, okay.
Well, even I've known people who cut off from family because they expressed it in therapy, that I feel like just cutting off from my family. And the therapist is not going to say, oh, that's haram, right? They're not going to say, don't, keeping good relations is important, or don't cut off, or they'll say, well, if you need that, do you know what I mean? Like they'll literally
they'll lay out the options for you.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, well, you could do this. This is one thing you could do, hypothetically speaking. You could cut off ties. And you could do this. And they lay out, so long as it's not like illegal from like a secular standpoint,
law perspective, exactly.
Then they'll just like put all of the cards on the table and then say, okay, so which one do you think is going to be the path of least resistance, or which one do you think is going to lead to your well-being? And there's all this vagueness that's in there, and this falls back on what we were talking about before. Everyone has a direction. They try to pretend that they're neutral, but it's not a neutral position, it's a secular one. And with that, it's within the confines of British law, which in and of itself isn't necessarily problematic, but it's just that, like, what it does is it opens up many possibilities that are not possibilities when it comes to an Islamic perspective. For example, I had a friend who had a child, and she was going through depression, and she was upset in that. And she just brought up this conundrum that she had, and she was like, and this was years ago. Maybe this was just near me taking my child. I'm not sure if it was before or after. But she was like, I don't know what to do. I was like, wow, what's up? I've got £10 left. Yeah. And I don't know whether I should buy nappies or go out on the lash or go out getting drunk. And I'm just looking like, what are you on about? How is this a conundrum? How is that second one even like an option on the table? Why have you got to think about this? Like, that shouldn't have even entered your head. Never mind be put down for deliberation. But her worldview has that as an option. There's nothing preventing that from sliding its way in and and entering the scales. Which one is it? Do I buy the nappies, or do I just go out and get drunk? But this is the thing. It's like, obviously Islam just gets rid of certain options. Right. That is just not a possibility.
Certain things
That's
are
not something. Yeah. So this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. Focus on your heart. So Iman increases and decreases, and it's not like a light switch. It's not simply on off. It's something that can be low sometimes. Like the tide, it goes in and out, in and out, in and out. And the scholars say that the Iman can increase and decrease based on obedience and disobedience. So when you do things that displease Allah or that incur His wrath, if you're disobedient, if you're doing things you shouldn't do, or not doing things you should do, this can have an impact on your heart. This can make you feel guilty, especially if you know you shouldn't be doing it or you should be doing it. This can wreak havoc on you and affect your Iman. When you do things that Allah is pleased with and you avoid things that you shouldn't do, so you do the things you should do and you don't do the things you shouldn't do, this can have a positive effect on your heart. And we know this. Ramadan is a perfect example where everyone, like, they're doing all these extra things. They're fasting every day. They're reading the Quran. They're lowering their gaze. They're watching how they talk. They're praying Taraweeh every day. They're doing extra, so much more, and they give up all the bad things. They stop smoking. They stop drinking. They stop smoking and everything. They just leave it all behind. And by the end of the month, they're like, Iman is sky high, and they're like, wow. And obviously part of that is that Ramadan is a blessed month, but a part of it as well is that you are doing extra. You are avoiding things that you don't usually avoid, and you're doing things you don't usually do. And this is having an impact on your iman. And then Ramadan ends, and then they're like, all right, back to normal. Let's start smoking again. Stop praying. Stop doing this. Stop doing that. And then they wonder why their iman is dropping again. And sometimes there can be a nasty feedback loop where someone maybe smokes, they feel guilty, so they avoid the prayer because they can't stand having to face Allah, knowing that they've done this. And because they do that, they suffer from guilt, and the guilt makes them avoid other things. And it has this sort of feedback loop of the like negative impact, and it just escalates and escalates and escalates, and it can get out of control. Now, you need to be self-reflective, and you need to teach people around you to be self-reflective and to focus on the heart as a vital organ that needs your attention. You can't neglect it. You can't act like people spend so much time and effort talking about the gym, making sure their muscles are like on point, or their hair's nice, or their beard's well combed, and everything's all nice and ironed. They're focusing on all of these things that are superficial in many ways. Obviously, there can be important aspects to it. I'm not someone completely against aesthetics. It's very important. But there's so much attention given to the neglect of other things that are important, to the neglect of the heart, to the neglect of social relations, to the neglect of all these other things. So you need to understand this is something important, and Allah loves small deeds done consistently. You don't have to go sell all your stuff and live in a cave. Like, you don't need to be extreme in your focus on your heart, but you do need to start implementing tiny little habits that you can manage and do consistently every day. Even if that's just like wake up a little bit early and try to pray 2 sunnah before Fajr, or you do your daily adhkar, or you do some dhikr after you pray Fajr and before you go to bed. Like, just something that's small, something that takes 5-10 minutes, read a page of the Quran, whatever it is. Just do something you can manage, that's not going to overburden you, overwhelm you, make you panic, make you feel extra stressed because life's already too busy. Or just stop something. There's something you should stop. Focus on that one thing and say, okay, I'm going to give this up. Whatever it is. Maybe I swear, maybe I smoke, maybe I drink, whatever it is. I'm just going to focus on this one bad habit, and I'm going to try and get that out of my life. Do these little things, and you will notice an impact on your heart. And when you notice that impact, you start to see how this relationship with Allah develops in obedience and avoiding disobedience, and learning, getting to know who Allah is, and learning who He is, and learning about the Prophet. When you learn about who they are, this develops your love for them, which is, again, focus on the heart. And when you love Allah, it becomes easier to want to obey Him. In the same way, when you love your parents, it's easier to do what they want because you love them. You don't want to upset them. However, when you have this sort of resentment to these people of authority in your life, for whatever reason, it may be, your father's fault, or it may be you. It may be like an act of rebellion in you that's blameworthy. Obviously, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if there is a problem with that relationship, that problem is with you. It can never be with Allah. Allahu Akbar. He's the greatest. He has no deficiencies. He is perfect. So if there is a problem with your relationship with Allah, then you have to look within yourself. That you have to be self-reflective and try to figure out why that is. And sometimes people just resent Allah because they've got bad things happening in their life, and they don't understand the Islamic context. Allah tests the ones He loves. They see it like He's attacking them, like He doesn't care for them because these things happening. And they don't understand the Islamic position. That not Allah tests the ones He loves, and that there's nothing that befalls a believer but that it is good for them. If they are tested with hardship, they are patient, and so it is good for them. If something good hits them, they are thankful, so it is good for them. And anything, anxiety, stress, pain, suffering, even the pricking of a thorn, all of these things can be means by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will expiate sins from you on the day of judgment, where you'll see them dissolve. And so you recognize the meaning in your suffering. You recognize there is a point to this. It's not just unnecessary evil or unnecessary stuff. Everything from the Islamic perspective is that it is infused with a purpose, with a meaning, and that it is ultimately a good for you, as hard as it might be, whatever it is, and just understanding that. And then the last thing is making dua. Understanding Allah simply can say be, and it will be, and asking Him for things. Allah loves the one who asks. So pray to Him, turn to Him in the dead of the night, when you're alone, like when you need things, turn to Him and ask. Make dua, make use of the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided for you. So that's the course in a nutshell. That took way longer.
Yeah, so all of these things are things that parents can be aware might be contributing to the to doubts that,
Yes.
or first of all, identifying whether it actually is a doubt or is just a whispering, and then some of the things that might be contributing, and just knowing that, I think it empowers parents, doesn't it,
Right.
to perhaps, just like a doctor, kind of prescribe, or to think, okay, what might work with my child.
Yeah.
We do have some questions. If anyone has any more questions, please do send them in. Okay, so we've got a question here. How to deal with a situation where they have constant doubt coming from their other parent who's an ex-Muslim. So I think this is a family where the parents have split up and the other parent is an ex-Muslim.
Yeah.
Um,
So this is a difficult one,
mm,
because there's going to be a lot of tension, and it depends on the relationship as well. And there's a lot that could be said there. And I don't want to give like a very specific answer to something that's quite vague
yeah.
without all that extra information. It depends. All I could say is do what you can. But what's important is you have to understand your context. You have to be the better parent. You have to be that when this child is growing up, and there's going to be shared custody to some degree, I guess. And what this child needs to see is that when they're with you, things are great. That your attention is with them. That are when basically you don't want to give them, because especially when they're children, they're not rational beings. They're not thinking things clearly. Like if you give them chocolate and ice cream for dinner every day, they're going to eat it. Like they're not thinking clearly. And so what they're operating on as children is on a fundamentally emotional level. And so you need to make sure that Islam is a part of your life, that you are visibly a Muslim, and that when they can see you praying, for example, they can see you fasting. You're not watching crap all the time. That you try to put on, I don't know, even if it's like Omar and Hannah, or depending on their age, you're trying to teach them Islam. Maybe you can take them to the mosque. When you have them, you do what's within your control. Now, if you don't have control over what the other parent says, so this is about making a distinction between what you can do and what you cannot do. You can try and speak to her or him and asking them not to do X, Y, and Z. And they may be reasonable. Depends on your relationship with them. And this is where, like, sort of, if you're co-parenting with an ex-partner, like your relationship with them is important as well. Like for example, I'm trying to think of what I can say without giving too much information. So yeah, there's two relationships you've got to work on. You've got to work on the relationship with your ex-partner, because you have to maintain some type of contact with them by necessity, because you share a child. And that relationship needs to be good so that they're not acting in resentment to you.
Right.
And so if that means like overlooking certain things and not picking fights with them, and if that means like, when they ask you for something, you don't pick up, like you're someone easy. Like for example, if they come to you and they're like, I need some money for this, if you can afford it, like it might be a bit annoying, like, oh, I've already given this much money, I've already given that money. But if you're thinking the long-term plan, if I'm just, as long as it's obviously not putting you in a difficult situation, but if I could just give them this, and this means that they won't resent me, and that they may warm up towards me, and when I ask them of something, they may respect that because I'm easy, because I can, like, they need money for the clothes, and they've only asked for half, I'll just send the full amount. Yeah, there's the money for all the clothes. If you can afford it, do it. Like, you need to do these little things to develop the relationship with the ex-partner and the child as well. And again, just work with what you have in your control. Do what you can. And if you're
Right.
the ex-partner, go on.
I was going to say, and also, like, if it's a father, right, then you might have to now become more aware that, okay, I need to make sure that my child has Muslim male figures in their life,
Yeah.
good Muslim, strong. Maybe it could be your brother, it could be their grandfather, whoever. But
Yeah.
they need to have that other male voice, and the opposite is true as well, right? Because at some point your child will decide, whether they're going to take on what this person is telling them or not. And if they've got other role models who love them to look up to, then hopefully, that voice will also be in their head. But
Yeah.
also, I would say, wouldn't you say that if the child does come home with and actually shares with the parent, things that the other parent is saying, um, that you would have to deal with that, meaning that you would have to answer those
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
questions, have the answers, and engage with it. In other words,
Yeah, and a good thing to do as well is you don't have to be like, well, from my perspective, you
Yeah.
include the child in it. You say, well, as Muslims, we don't believe
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
And you can't treat the child like the child is sort of this neutral judge
Yes.
trying to
Yes.
figure
Yes.
out which one. You just include the child in your circle and say, well, you're
Yes.
a
That
Muslim, I'm a
makes sense.
Muslim.
Exactly.
We don't believe that. We believe Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is the messenger and he said this. And so we believe in that. And if you understand as well, like, and this is why it's important about understanding why you're a Muslim. Yeah, why is it that Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is a messenger, the final messenger? And looking at the options, like, he could have been this, he could have been this, he could have been that. None of these make sense. And there's lots of good material out there that makes a case for the prophethood of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, or makes the case for the divinity of the Quran. Yeah, and there's like you can get like really good two good books off the bat. Abu Zakaria, he's got I've got them at my house, I'm not here. The Forbidden Prophecies, which just focuses on the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's prophecies and comparing them to other famous like Nostradamus, Hindu astrology, all of that, and just showing how their worlds apart. They're incomparable. A Journey Through the Miraculous Quran is another book he did, which just focuses on the Quran and its miraculous nature. Just these two books, they're very short, they're not long, but they give you something, to work with,
Right.
and you can bring these forward and say, well, we believe the Quran, like it. We have good reasons to be Muslims. We're not like the Quraysh when Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, "What are you doing?" Or like the people of Ibrahim when asked, "What are you doing?" They just say, "Oh, it's just mum and dad." They followed it. Muslims are not like that. We're implored to follow Islam, not because mum and dad do, but because it's true. Because Allah Subhanahu wa Taala exists, because He is one, and because Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is the messenger of Allah, and we have good reasons for believing that, and so we incline towards it, and that is the default position. That is the norm. That's how we don't say, oh, from this perspective, that perspective, because that can confuse the kid, because now it's being presented as if it's a choice,
an option.
Yeah, and it isn't. It is explicitly the truth, and we have good reasons for that. And obviously, you've got to be careful, because sometimes kids can accidentally act as instigators for arguments, and they go back and they tell you what the ex-partner said, and then they go back to the ex-partner and tell them what you said. So you've got to keep that in mind as well. But again, you can only do what you have in control, and you need to deal with these things. You can't completely ignore them. But a lot of it is just about dealing with it in the best way, having good etiquettes, adab, when talking to the child, not being abusive. No, not turning the other parent into an enemy. As much as they may act like one sometimes, you have to get the child to understand, listen, you've got to be patient with your mother, and instill good etiquettes with the child towards the parent, and because you've got no choice. Yeah, if you act with enmity in this relationship, you could lose the contact with the child altogether. Because you've got to keep in mind as well that the secular environment inclines towards the individual, and in a dispute between a religious person and a secular person, the secular person is going to come out on top in a court system, because they can just simply say, oh, they're forcing their religion upon them. They're extreme. Look at, he's got a beard. He prays 5 times a day. He makes me starve Ramadan. Like, they can just say all these things, and especially if they don't fear Allah, there's no restraint anymore. They can just say whatever they want, whether it's true or not. It doesn't matter. So you have to be careful.
I have another question here. What is the best way to prepare your youngster with strong faith and concise actions? Where should we start from?
I'm guessing that's what this whole course is sort of focusing on. Isn't it?
It is, yes.
So just remember what you've been learning with
bit by bit, slowly but surely building the iman. And I mean, we talk a lot about nature, like getting kids out in nature, appreciating Allah's creation. So remembering that deep down, they've already got it in them, Fitrah is already in them. So it's about us nurturing it and not allowing it to be covered, right?
Yeah. And if it is covered, then it's about trying to peel back the coverings and
Right.
recognizing what it is that's covering it exactly. And this is where, like, just sitting down, being a parent that your children feel comfortable going to and asking questions.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
even if the question they're asking can be considered blameworthy to a certain degree, you have to understand as well who it is that's asking it. Like, a child is not blameworthy. Like, if you've got like someone who is young and they're asking these things, you don't go in there and start slapping them up. Like, you've got to understand this kid doesn't know what's going on. And so they may say, like, they may question Allah, for example, and say, why did Allah do that? And like, obviously, like, as adults, we might know there's certain things you cannot question. You just have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded X, Y, and Z, or he's told us this about himself, or he's told us this about the afterlife. Like, you can't be rebellious against that. You can't, like, push against Allah, like you are greater than him, or you have access to knowledge he doesn't. Because part of, entailed in that is kufr. But with children, they're innocent. They're not, we're not Christians. We don't believe in this, like, sort of born with sin. You have to recognize who's asking you, the context from which they're asking from, being empathetic to the environment. Like, if you're sending them to a public school and they've got all these kids coming at them asking these questions, sometimes it's just a case of they might want to know how to answer them. It's not even necessarily coming from them, from their own hearts. It's coming from the hearts of disbelievers. And so asking questions, why are you asking that? Like, rather than just saying, don't. Yeah, like, exactly. Trying to unpack what's going on, figure out what's happening. Don't just go
but
in.
Not make them feel bad about having expressed it to you, because actually the very fact that they've expressed it means that they felt safe enough to do that with you, right? Yeah. And if you shut them down, they'll find somebody else to talk to who might not be the right person.
Yeah,
right?
Who may be secular, who may be an atheist, who may tell them, your parents are just, this is equivalent to Santa Claus, blah 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 blah. And that's the worst situation. Like, it's they're the person that they fall back on for that spiritual assistance. It's someone that, like, does not believe in Islam whatsoever. That's just gonna wreak havoc.
There are some other questions, but I feel like you've actually answered them through the course of this session. So I would encourage the parents who've asked those last questions to please go back, and if you weren't here right from the beginning, go back and listen to the recording, and you'll see that many of your issues or questions have been already answered, inshallah. So I just want to thank you, Brother Yusuf, for this session. Thank you so much for going through that with us, and also for sharing your own experiences, because I think that's very helpful as well, to hear. And also it gives us hope, especially like the story you told us about yourself, but also the young person who you spoke to recently, and you just realize that it actually, sometimes something that seems like a big crisis actually might just be something very simple going on in the person's life, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Please make dua for all of our parents.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make things easy for you all, and give you and those you love victory in this world and in the next. Ameen.
Jazakallah khairan, Brother Yusuf. And everyone, please do go to the website and the links that we've shared with you. And with that, we will end the session. Jazakumullah khairan. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.